The morning Belle Talmadge rode into Harlan's Creek. 3 separate people stopped her on the main road to warn her about Hugh Shelby before she had even tied her horse to a post, and every single one of them used the exact same word, cold. She had come from Abilene, Kansas, in the fall of 1873, which was already late enough in the season that the cottonwood trees lining the creek road had gone yellow at their edges. She was 24 years old, dark-haired and possessed of a directness that most people in that era and territory found unsettling in a woman. She had a letter folded in her coat pocket from a land attorney named Clement Voss, who had informed her that her late uncle, Randall Talmadge, had left her 40 acres of pasture land and a small cattle operation just north of town. The cattle numbered somewhere around 30 head, the letter said, and the operation had been maintained in her uncle's absence by a ranch hand arrangement that was now expired. She was to come and take possession, or the land would revert to a territorial holding within 60 days. So she had come. The first warning came from a woman selling dried apple rings near the feed store, a broad-shouldered woman with sun-darkened cheeks who looked at Belle's destination, the Talmadge plot. She had said just north, past the old windmill, and shook her head slowly before speaking. "You'll have Hugh Shelby as your nearest neighbor then," the woman said. "Just so you are prepared. He is not a sociable man." "I do not require sociable neighbors," Belle said pleasantly. "I require a working water access and a fence line that holds." The woman gave her a look that said she had not understood the warning properly and handed her the dried apple rings for free. The second warning came from the land attorney himself, Clement Voss, who met her at his office on the south side of Main Street. He was a small man with wire spectacles and ink permanently stained into his left index finger. He went through the paperwork with her efficiently enough, but when he came to the section about boundary lines and easements, he paused. "Your northern fence line shares a corner post with the Shelby property," he said. "Hugh Shelby has been known to dispute neighborly matters." "Has he done anything unlawful?" Belle asked. "Not technically," Voss said, adjusting his spectacles. "He is simply the man does not engage. If there is a disagreement, he does not negotiate. He does not discuss. He simply stares at a person until they feel the conversation has ended on his terms." "That does sound like a useful skill," Belle said. Voss looked at her over his spectacles and seemed to reconsider something about the whole situation. The third warning came from a boy of about 12 who was sweeping the boardwalk outside the general store when Belle came out with flour and salt pork and a new coil of rope. He had apparently heard her ask the storekeeper about the Talmadge Road and had appointed himself a source of local intelligence. "You're going up by Shelby's place?" the boy asked. "On past it," Belle said, loading her purchases into the saddlebag. "He don't talk," the boy said. "Tommy Greer's father tried to talk to him about a fence line last spring, and Mr. Shelby just looked at him until Mr. Greer walked away. My mama says he lost somebody and it turned him to stone." Belle paused with her hand on the saddlebag buckle. "Who did he lose?" The boy shrugged with the philosophical casualness of childhood. "Everybody says something different. Some say a wife. Some say a brother. Old Mrs. Hatch says it was both." Belle finished fastening the buckle, swung up into the saddle, and looked down at the boy. "Well," she said, "stone can be warmed by sun. That is a fact of geology." The boy stared at her as she rode north out of Harlan's Creek, and she did not look back. The Talmadge land was exactly as described and somewhat better than she had hoped. The house was small, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, but it had been built solid, the kind of construction that her uncle, who had been a careful and particular man, would have overseen personally. The roof needed attention at the north corner where a section of cedar shingles had warped and lifted, and the barn was missing 2 boards low on the east wall, but the well was clean and the pasture fence, though weathered, held its line. The cattle were another matter. 28 head, not 30, which meant either 2 had been lost to something or the attorney's count had been approximate from the start. They were decent animals, mixed longhorn and a smaller breed, and they appeared healthy enough, but they were scattered across 40 acres with no hand to organize them, and the watering trough near the barn had a crack running along its base that let it drain to nothing by midday. Belle spent her first afternoon doing an inventory. She had enough money from the sale of her mother's house in Abilene. Her mother had passed in the spring, which was partly what had made the move possible and partly what had made it necessary to run the operation lean for one season. She could fix the roof, fix the trough, mend the east wall of the barn, and survive the winter if the cattle sold well in spring. She could hire day labor for the heavy work if she was careful about what she asked them to do. What she could not do was everything herself, and what she was going to need before the first serious frost, which in this part of Kansas in 1873 meant sometime in late October, roughly 4 weeks away, was a working knowledge of which of her fence lines were solid and which were not. Because cattle in broken fence country walked away in the night, and cattle that walked away in the night very often walked onto somebody else's land, and that somebody else, according to 3 separate sources, was Hugh Shelby. She decided to introduce herself proactively. It seemed logical. It seemed, in fact, like the only sensible thing to do, because a woman running a small cattle operation alone in 1873, in the territory of Kansas, did not have the luxury of letting disputes fester. Disputes cost time and time cost cattle and cattle cost money and money was the whole architecture of the thing. She rode the boundary line of her property the next morning, following the fence north. It was a clear day. The sky, that particular deep blue that only appears in Kansas in October, hard and cloudless and enormous in the way that Kansas sky is enormous, as if the land beneath it is so flat that the heavens have simply spread out to fill all the available space. The corner post where her land met Hugh Shelby's was a thick cedar post driven deep, wrapped in rusting barbed wire where the 2 lines met at a right angle. Beyond it, the Shelby property was visible as a wider, more substantial operation, better maintained fencing, more head of cattle visible in the middle distance, a barn that looked recently painted, and a house set back from the road with a covered porch running the full length of its front face. Hugh Shelby was at the fence when she arrived. Not waiting for her, she understood that immediately. He was working. He had a post driver in his hands, and he was resetting a fence post about 40 yards inside his own line, driving it with the kind of focused physical effort that requires all of a person's attention. He was tall, she registered that from some distance, and broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from actual labor rather than youth, and he wore no coat despite the October chill, only a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He did not look up as she rode closer. She stopped her horse at the corner post, a bay gelding named Congressman who had no strong feelings about anything, which was exactly the quality she valued in a horse, and she said, "Mr. Shelby." He drove the post once more. The sound of the driver meeting the post head rang out clean and metallic in the cold air. "Mr. Shelby," she said again, not louder, not softer. He looked up then, and she understood immediately and without any need for further elaboration everything that the woman with the apple rings and the attorney and the boy with the broom had been trying to tell her. He had gray eyes, gray the way certain winter clouds are gray, not dull but actually the color of something with considerable weather in it, and a face that had been constructed for expression and had simply chosen not to use it. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little older. The jaw was squared, the mouth set in a line that was not unkind so much as categorically uninviting. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post that has appeared in an unexpected location. "I am Belle Talmadge," she said. "I have taken possession of the Randall Talmadge land to your south. I wanted to introduce myself and to let you know that I intend to check my fence lines thoroughly over the next week, and if any of my cattle have strayed onto your land, I would appreciate knowing so I can retrieve them promptly." There was a pause. It was not an uncomfortable pause on her end. She had grown up with a taciturn father, and she understood that silence was not always hostility, but it was a considerable pause. "None of your cattle are on my land," he said. His voice, when it came, was low and even, not unfriendly in its tone but not warm either. The voice of a man who had decided that words were a limited resource and was being careful about expenditure. "Thank you," she said. "And if they are at some point in the future, please send word and I will come immediately." He looked at her for another moment, that stare that Mr. Voss had warned her about, the one designed to end conversations, and then he said, "Are you running the Talmadge operation alone?" She was slightly surprised by the question, not because it was impertinent but because it was a question at all. "Yes," she said. "Your well is on the western side of your property," he said. "There is a secondary water source along the creek at the northeast corner of your land. Most people who have worked that plot don't know about it because your uncle favored the well. But come winter, if the well ices, you'll want the creek access." She looked at him. He had said more words just now than she had expected from the reputation, and all of them practical and useful. "Thank you," she said. "I did not know that." He nodded once and picked up his post driver again. She rode back to her own land with the October sky enormous above her, and the cottonwoods going steadily more gold at their edges, and the thought turning in her mind that the coldest man in 3 counties had just given her information she needed, unprompted, on the first meeting. Stone, she thought again, warmed by sun. Over the following 2 weeks, Belle Talmadge established herself as a competent and determined presence on the Talmadge land. She hired a local man named Deverell Hodge for 3 days to help with the heavy work on the roof, paying him fairly and working beside him herself rather than directing from the ground, which surprised him considerably. She fixed the east wall of the barn using boards she pulled from a collapsed outbuilding on the far side of the property, which saved her the cost of new lumber. She repaired the water trough using a technique her uncle had shown her once, with river clay packed into a crack and sealed with pine pitch, and she was cautiously pleased when it held water through a full day and night. The cattle were her primary concern. She branded 3 that her uncle had evidently missed in a previous season, not uncommon in a small operation maintained by hired hands with their attention spread thin. And she began the slower process of understanding which animals were calm and which were problems. There was a bull among them, a rangy red longhorn she privately named Diplomat because he appeared to broker peace between the other animals through sheer bovine authority, and she was grateful for him. A calm bull was worth more than the sum of his parts. She saw Hugh Shelby 3 times in those 2 weeks, each time at a distance. Once along the shared fence line, where he was again doing some maintenance work that she could not quite make out. Once on the road into Harlan's Creek, going the opposite direction from her, and he tipped his hat, which she noted with some private interest, because it was a small gesture but a gesture nonetheless, more than she had been told to expect. And once in the evening, as she was standing at the northeast corner of her property following his directions to find the creek access, she looked up and saw him on his own side of the fence, watching. She raised a hand. After a moment, he raised one back, and then he turned and walked toward his barn. She found the creek access exactly where he said it would be. She also found in those 2 weeks that Harlan's Creek itself was a town with considerable personality. It had been established in the 1860s and had grown with the cattle trade that ran up through that part of Kansas, and it had the particular character of a town that had seen real wildness and was now in the process of deciding who it wanted to be. There was a sheriff, a man named Cal Prout, who was efficient and well-regarded, and who had managed to keep serious violence at a low level that most cattle towns of the era could not claim. There was a good general store run by a man named Albright who stocked things with intelligence. There was a doctor, which was more than some towns twice the size could say, a young man from Ohio named Dr. Marcus Fenn, who had come west for reasons he declined to specify, and who appeared to have found in Harlan's Creek a place he could be useful enough to stay. There was also a woman named Rosalind Greer, married to the same Mr. Greer, who had been stared into retreat by Hugh Shelby at a fence line, who made it her personal mission to be friendly to Belle, which Belle appreciated genuinely. Rosalind was 30, practical, funny in a dry way that appealed to Belle's temperament, and she was the primary source of actual usable information about the town. Hugh Shelby, Rosalind said, on a Wednesday when she had come to bring Belle a casserole dish of venison stew and stayed to sit on the porch in the October sunshine, came here in 1869. He bought the Shelby land outright, which meant he had money somewhere that he has never explained to anyone's satisfaction. He built the place up properly. Good operation. He did talk more in the beginning. My husband says he remembers him as a man who would stop and pass the time of day, not warm exactly but present. What changed? Belle asked. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. His wife came out from Missouri to join him in 1870. Margaret, her name was. She was expecting their first child when she arrived. She died in the winter of 1870, the baby with her, and Hugh Shelby became whatever he is now. Belle was quiet with that for a time. That is a grief with no bottom to it, she said finally. My husband says when he tried to express his condolences, Hugh Shelby thanked him in one word and walked away, and that was the last conversation of any substance they have had, Rosalind said. Not mean about it, just sealed, like a jar. Belle thought about the creek access information, volunteered without prompting. She thought about the hat tip on the road. She thought about the way he had watched her from across the fence in the evening and then raised his hand when she raised hers. Jars can be open, she said. Rosalind looked at her sideways. Belle Talmadge, she said, please be careful. I am always careful, Belle said, which was a complicated kind of truth. It was on the third Saturday after her arrival, with October winding toward its end, and the mornings arriving now with frost on the grass that melted by 9, that Belle had her first real conversation with Hugh Shelby. She had gone to check the northeast fence line, the one that ran along the boundary closest to his property, and found that 3 panels of wire had come down overnight. Not broken, cut. She stood and looked at the clean cuts in the wire and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the October air move through her. Cut wire meant someone had done it intentionally. Cut wire on a cattle operation was a message, or it was cattle theft in preparation, or it was both. 2 of her cattle had gone through. She could see their tracks in the frost-stiffened mud, heading north. She followed the tracks on foot because the ground was soft enough near the creek to read clearly. They went north, as she expected, and they went through a gap in a second fence also cut, and then north further along the creek bank, and then she lost them in the harder ground beyond, where the cattle trail from the Shelby operation had compacted the earth over years. She stood at the edge of Hugh Shelby's land and considered her options, and then she walked to his gate and let herself through and knocked on the door of his barn, because that was where a working rancher would be at 7 in the morning. The barn door opened. He looked at her, holding a length of harness leather he had apparently been oiling. Someone cut my northeast fence line, she said. 3 panels. 2 of my cattle came through. I tracked them to your property line and lost them. His expression shifted barely, but she was watching for it. Something that was not quite a frown but was the precursor to one. When, he said, overnight, the cuts are clean, wire cutters not weathering. He set down the harness leather. Come. It was not an invitation so much as a statement of what was happening next, and she followed him around the barn to the eastern side of his property, where his own cattle grazed in the early morning, and he walked the visible herd with a practiced eye, and she walked beside him looking for the 2 animals she was missing, a roan cow with a distinctive notch in her left ear and a younger steer that was heavier in the flank than the rest. There, he said, pointing. Both her animals were in the southeast corner of his pasture, grazing alongside 3 of his own cattle, with the complete indifference of bovines who have found adequate grass and consider the matter settled. The roan cow's notched ear was unmistakable. I appreciate you helping me identify them, Belle said. I will come back with a lead and move them back through my fence once I have repaired it. I will help you with the fence, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the cattle with that still, closed expression, and then he turned to look at her, and for a moment there was something in those gray eyes that she could not name, not warmth exactly, not yet, but something that was at least in the same territory. Something that was paying attention. That is generous, she said. I will not refuse the help. Do you know who cut your wire? He said. I have not been here long enough to have made enemies, she said, but I have been here long enough for certain people to notice that I am a woman running a cattle operation alone and to consider what that might mean for them. He was quiet with that for a moment. Then, there is a man named Garrett Foss. He runs cattle east of town. He has made offers on 2 neighboring properties in the last 2 years, and both times the owners left under circumstances that were never proven to be anything but bad luck. A pause. Your land is between his eastern parcel and the creek access that all the eastern operations share. He has wanted the Talmadge land before. Did he approach my uncle? She said. Your uncle died before Foss could complete whatever he was planning, Hugh said, or so I have always assumed. Belle looked at the recovered cattle grazing peacefully in the morning light and breathed in slowly through her nose. That is useful information, she said. Thank you. It is not proof of anything, he said. Only a direction to look. A direction is enough, she said. They repaired the fence together that morning. Hugh with the efficiency of a man who had done the work 1,000 times, and Belle matching him well enough that he did not feel the need to explain things she clearly already knew. He did not make small talk. Neither did she. But there was a quality to the silence between them that was different from isolation. It was shared silence, the silence of 2 people working toward the same goal in proximity, and that is a different animal entirely. When they were done and the wire was tight again, he checked the work with one gloved hand running the length of the repaired section, and then he looked at her and said, You know how to run fence? My uncle taught me, she said. I spent 3 summers here as a girl, before he sold the operation the first time. He believed in teaching things properly regardless of who was to be taught. Something passed across Hugh Shelby's face, not a smile, not quite, but a loosening at the corners of his mouth that was the structural suggestion of one. He was a good man, he said. Belle Talmadge. I did business with him twice before he became ill. He was straight in his dealings. He was, Belle said. He was the best man I knew. She said it simply, without seeking sympathy for the loss, and he received it the same way, as a statement of fact about a person who had mattered, which is the most honest form of grief. They walked back toward their respective property lines in the light that had strengthened now to full morning, the frost long gone from the grass, and at the corner post where their fence lines met he stopped and said, If you have further trouble with the wire, come and get me. I will, she said. And I want to be clear with you, I am not going to be moved off that land. If Garrett Foss is the kind of man you are describing, I want him to know that early. Hugh Shelby looked at her with those winter cloud gray eyes and said something she did not expect. I know, he said. I could see that the first day you rode up. She did not know exactly what to do with that, so she simply nodded and went home to tend her cattle, and she thought about the way he had said it, not as a compliment, not as flattery, but as an observation of fact, the same way he had told her about the creek access, the way he gave information that was useful and nothing more and nothing less. She found herself thinking about him more than she had anticipated. She was honest with herself about it because dishonesty with oneself in lonely country was a luxury no one could afford. October narrowed. The nights came earlier and the mornings came colder, and the cottonwoods went from yellow to a deep burning gold that lasted 3 days, and then dropped all at once so that the creek road was carpeted in gold leaf that crackled under Congressman's hooves when she rode into town. The situation with Garrett Foss developed in the way that these things developed in 1873 Kansas, which is to say that it moved through formal channels and informal ones simultaneously, and the informal ones were considerably more direct. She had gone to see Sheriff Cal Prout, presenting him with the cut fence wire and the direction that Hugh had suggested. Prout was a careful man, careful in the best sense, meaning he was thorough rather than cautious, and he listened well and said he would look into Garrett Foss's recent movements and have a conversation with the man. He is not someone to take lightly, Prout warned her. Neither am I, Belle said pleasantly. Prout smiled despite himself. No, he said, I am coming to understand that. Foss himself came to her property 4 days after the fence cutting, which was brazen but perhaps calculated to appear innocent. He was a heavy-set man of about 50 with a red face and pale eyes, and the confident manner of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of wealth and implied threat. He rode up to her front porch on a well-bred horse, and he was very polite and offered to buy her land at a price that was, she could tell, somewhat below fair market value, but not so far below that he would look obviously insulting. I am not interested in selling, she said, from the porch steps. Miss Talmadge, he said, and she noted the miss rather than the misses because the distinction was deliberate. Running a cattle operation alone is no small undertaking for a person in your situation. The winters here are hard. The work is considerable. I am offering you a way to take your money and return to, he paused. Wherever you came from, Abilene, is it? I am not from Abilene, she said. Harlan's Creek is where I am from now. He studied her for a moment with those pale eyes, and then he smiled, which was worse than the hard look. Well, he said, I hope you will reconsider. The offer stands for 2 weeks. It can stand for 2 years, Belle said. My answer will be the same. He rode away, and she stood on the porch steps and watched him go, and she felt the particular quality of fear that is not cowardice but is honest acknowledgement of real danger, and she breathed through it steadily until it settled into something she could work with. That evening, Hugh Shelby appeared at her fence gate. This had not happened before. He had always been encountered at the boundary line or on the road, always in the context of work. Coming to her gate was a different thing, and she recognized it as such, and she felt something shift slightly in her chest when she saw him standing there in the early dark with his hat in his hand. She came down from the porch to meet him. Mr. Shelby, Foss came here today, he said. I saw him on the road. He made an offer, she said. I declined it. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat by the brim. It was a habit, she realized, that turning of the hat that indicated he was working through something. He had a man on the road north of your property yesterday, Hugh said. Watching the place. I saw him from the upper fence line. Don't know him by name, but I've seen him working for Foss before. Surveillance, she said, and felt a chill that was purely situational. Or preparation, he said. I want you to know that if there is further trouble, I am close by, is what I mean to say. She looked at him in the early dark, at the hat turning in those capable hands, and she understood that this was the closest thing to an offer of alliance and protection that Hugh Shelby was currently able to produce, and that it had cost him something to produce it, and that the cost had nothing to do with reluctance and everything to do with the particular kind of pain that makes a person careful about what they offer because they know what it feels like when those things are taken away. Thank you, she said. I am glad to have you close by. He put his hat back on and nodded once and walked back toward his property, and she stood at her fence gate in the early dark for a long moment after he had gone. The next 3 days were quiet in the way that Kansas can be quiet before weather, a held-breath quality in the air that experienced people read as a warning. She worked her cattle, repaired the loft ladder in her barn, and made a trip to town for supplies. On her way back, Rosalind Greer caught her outside the general store. Belle, Rosalind said, in the lowered voice of a woman who has information and wants to deliver it before it goes stale. My husband was at the feed store yesterday, and he overheard Garrett Foss talking to 2 of his men. He couldn't hear everything, but he caught enough. Foss is planning to move more cattle through your northeast pasture, using the creek access. He believes he can establish a right-of-way if his cattle use the route enough times without resistance. That is not how property law works, Belle said. Foss does not particularly care how property law works, Rosalind said. He cares how things look after the fact. Belle rode home with this information and thought it through carefully. The northeast corner of her property, the creek access that Hugh had told her about, was the piece Foss wanted. If he could establish the appearance of regular use, he could argue easement rights in court, and court cases in 1873 Kansas favored men with money and standing. She did not have enough of either. What she had was a neighbor who knew the land as well as she was coming to know it, and a fence line they had repaired together, and the particular kind of alliance that comes from two people who have stood side by side in early morning cold and done work that needed doing. She went to Hugh Shelby's gate that evening. He came out of his barn when he heard Congressman's hooves on the drive, and he walked toward the gate, and there was something in the way he walked toward her direct, without hesitation, that she noticed the same way she had noticed things about him all along, carefully, without letting herself read too much into any single thing. "I need to tell you what Rosalind Greer told me today," she said, "and I need to ask if you would be willing to help me make a plan." They sat on his porch for the first time, her on the step, him in the single wooden chair, and she told him everything, and he listened with the complete attention that she had come to understand was simply how he engaged when he engaged, no partial presence with Hugh Shelby, all of him or none. "The creek access," he said when she was done. "He's wanted it since I've been here. He tried to buy my land 2 years ago. I said no. And then he had a man cut 3 of my fence posts," Hugh said. "I replaced them. He had a man do it again. I stayed at that fence line for 3 nights with a rifle across my knees until they stopped." 3 nights, Belle said. "It worked," he said, with a flatness that was not quite amusement but was in the vicinity. "What I need," she said, "is for the northeast pasture to look actively managed. Cattle in it, me visible in it, the creek access clearly part of my working land and not an abandoned corner. If he can't establish that it looks unused or undefended, the easement argument falls apart." "Move your cattle to the northeast pasture," Hugh said, "and I will move mine to the matching corner on my side. 2 active operations using the creek, both visible, both managed. That kills his argument entirely." She looked at him. "That is a considerable inconvenience to your operation." "It is a week's worth of moving cattle," he said. "It is not considerable." "Hugh," she said, and she had not used his first name before, and he went very still in his chair when she said it. "Why are you helping me?" The question sat in the evening air between them. An owl called somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek. The first stars were coming out over the enormous Kansas sky. "Because Foss is wrong and you are right," he said, and then after a pause that contained something more, "and because I have watched you work for 3 weeks and you do not ask for more than is reasonable, and you do not expect to be handed things, and you work as hard as the land requires." Another pause. "I admire that." It was the most he had said at once in her hearing. She could see what it cost him to say it, not emotionally dramatic but genuinely effortful, a man who had gone a long time without the practice of saying things that matter about people who matter. "I admire the same qualities in you," she said simply, "and I am glad you are my neighbor, Mr. Shelby." "Hugh," he said, "if you are going to use the name." "Hugh," she said, and the owl called again. The plan worked with a practical efficiency that satisfied Belle deeply. Moving the cattle to the northeast corner was 2 days' work for both of them. They drove the animals without drama, Hugh reading the land and the cattle with an ease that she matched more than she expected. And when they were done, the northeast pasture was alive with movement and sound, and the clear evidence of active use. Garrett Foss sent a man to look. They watched him from across the creek, Belle on her side, Hugh on his, and the man on Foss's behalf sitting on his horse at a distance, looking at 2 well-managed cattle operations on either side of the creek access point, and then turning and riding away. "He won't try the easement argument now," Hugh said. "No," Belle said. "But he will try something else." She was right. 4 days later, in the deep blue cold of a late October morning, the kind of morning where frost stood in white sheets on the grass and the air smelled of the winter that was now genuinely coming, 2 or 3 weeks away at most, She went out to check her cattle at first light and found the gate to the northeast pasture standing open. The cattle were gone, all 28 head, including Diplomat the red longhorn bull. Gone through the open gate and into the pre-dawn dark, and the tracks in the frost led not north toward Hugh's property but east, toward Foss's land. She stood at the open gate with her heart hammering and her breath making steam in the cold air, and she understood that this was not mischief, this was not pressure. This was the taking of her livelihood. Without those cattle she could not survive the winter. Without surviving the winter she lost the land. And without the land she had nothing to return to and nothing to go toward. She ran to the barn, saddled Congressman in the dark, and rode north to Hugh Shelby's gate. She did not need to knock. He was already coming out of his house as she rode up. He must have heard Congressman's hooves on the road, or perhaps he simply slept lightly, the way people do when they have learned that bad things can happen at any hour. He took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" Not a question, a recognition. "My cattle are gone," she said. "All of them, driven east, Foss's direction." He went back inside for exactly 45 seconds. She counted and came out with his rifle, his coat, and his horse already bridled, which meant he had saddled it in a speed that under other circumstances would have impressed her. "Come," he said. They rode east together in the pre-dawn dark, following the cattle tracks that were clear enough in the frosted ground to read by the early gray light beginning to bleed into the eastern sky. The tracks went east along the creek bank, and then turned south on a road Belle did not know, a wagon road that cut through the grassland toward Foss's eastern property. They had ridden perhaps 2 miles when they heard the cattle lowing in the dark, the particular complaint of animals that have been moved fast and do not understand why, and then the creak of a gate and voices. Hugh stopped his horse and looked at her, and she looked back at him. "We go to Prout," she said, "and we go now. If we go onto Foss's land in the dark with a rifle, it becomes something other than what it is." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see in the growing light that he was wound tight with the desire to do the simpler, faster thing. But he nodded. "Prout," he said. They rode to town and woke Cal Prout at 6 in the morning, and Belle presented the evidence with precision: the open gate, the tracks, the direction, the voices they had heard, and Prout, who had been building his own file on Garrett Foss for some time, sent for his deputy and rode out within 20 minutes. Belle and Hugh rode with them. The confrontation at Foss's eastern gate was the kind of scene that Harlan's Creek would talk about for years afterward, not because of any violence, there was none, but because of the quality of Prout's legal precision and the spectacular failure of Foss's confident bluster when faced with 2 credible witnesses and a sheriff who had been waiting for exactly this. Belle's cattle were in Foss's east pen, every one of them, including Diplomat, who regarded the proceedings with regal indifference. The 2 men Foss employed to drive them had been hired through an intermediary, Foss's customary method, but Prout had dealt with that intermediary before and knew how to apply pressure, and within an hour, one of the hired men had said enough to establish that the orders had come from Foss's operation. Foss blustered. He threatened legal action. He suggested that the cattle had wandered. He made the particular kind of statements that men make when the wall is coming down around their position, and they have not yet accepted that the wall is coming down. Prout arrested him on a charge of cattle theft, which in Kansas in 1873 was a serious matter. He would make bail, a man like Foss always made bail, but the case would go to trial, and Belle had Hugh Shelby and 2 of Foss's own former employees as witnesses, and the story in Harlan's Creek would not be kind to Garrett Foss's reputation regardless of what the court ultimately decided. Belle drove her cattle home herself, riding behind them with Congressman steady as a stone, and Hugh rode beside her, and neither of them said much for the first mile because there was not yet the right shape for what needed to be said. Then Hugh said, "You were right to go to Prout. You wanted to go through that gate," she said. Yes, he said with the clean honesty that was, she was coming to understand, one of his defining qualities. But you were right. I know, she said, and he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was brief, caught almost before it happened, a single quiet exhalation of genuine amusement. But it was real. She felt it land somewhere in the center of her chest like sunlight through a window. She did not remark on it. She just drove her cattle home through the October morning and let him ride beside her. And the space between them was comfortable in a way that had been building for weeks and now felt settled and natural. Diplomat walked back into his pasture with great dignity and began eating immediately. Belle watched him and felt the tension of the last hours drain from her shoulders, and she turned to find Hugh Shelby standing a few feet away watching her with an expression that was no longer quite so carefully closed. "Come in for breakfast," she said. "I owe you that much." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know," she said, "but I am asking you to come in anyway." A pause. He looked at the house, at the porch, at the smoke from the chimney where she had banked a fire before riding out in the dark. Then he dismounted and tied his horse at the post and followed her inside. She made coffee and eggs and salt pork and cornbread that she had the batter ready for from the night before, and he sat at her table and took his hat off and set it on the table beside him. And for the first time she saw him fully without the hat. The dark hair shot through with a thread or two of early gray at the temples, the lines around his eyes that came from years of reading distance. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a companionable silence, the silence of two people who had been through a difficult morning together and were allowing themselves the recovery of a hot meal. Halfway through the coffee, she told him about her mother, about Abilene, about why she had come. She did not tell it as a sad story, she told it as the story of how she had arrived here, which was what it was. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done he said, "My wife was from Missouri. She came out to join me in the winter of 1870. I had built the house by then. I had thought," he stopped, began again, careful with each word. "I had thought the hard part was the building, the first season, getting the land working. I had thought that once she arrived the difficulty would ease." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She died in January, the baby with her. The doctor in this town then was an old man, not Fenn. He did what he could." Belle said nothing. She simply listened. "I did not know how to." He was quiet for a long moment. "I closed everything, is the only way I can describe it. I worked. I kept the land running. I stopped speaking to people because every conversation required me to be present in a way I could not manage. Rosalind Greer told me a little," Belle said quietly. "I hope that does not seem like I was prying." "Rosalind Greer has a kind heart," he said. "Whatever she told you was told kindly." "It was," Belle said. "She told me you were grieving. She did not say it as gossip." He looked at her across the table. The morning light was full now, coming through the east window, and in that light his gray eyes were not winter cloud gray at all, but something warmer, the gray of wood smoke, the gray of river stones under clear water. "You are the first person in 3 years," he said, "that I have sat and talked with." She was careful with how she received that. "I am glad," she said. "I have needed someone to talk with too." November came to Harlan's Creek the following week with a hard wind from the northwest, and the first proper frost that sat on the ground from dusk to mid-morning, and did not pretend to be temporary. Belle pulled her root vegetables from the kitchen garden and stored them in the cold cellar under the house, stacked her cured wood higher against the barn wall, and checked her cattle's condition against the coming winter with the careful attention of someone who understood that the margin for error was narrow. Hugh came by twice that week to help. Once to look at the cold cellar door, which was hanging crooked and needed to be refit, and once to help move a hay bale delivery from the road to the barn, the delivery man having declined to take his wagon any further given the state of the drive after the first night's frost. Both times they worked together in the now comfortable way that had developed between them, and both times he stayed after the work was done. The second time, on a Thursday evening with the sky going orange and violet in the west and the temperature dropping by the minute, They sat on the porch in their coats, and she asked him about Margaret. Not intrusively, just openly, as if the question had a right to be asked between people who had come to trust each other. He talked about her for 20 minutes, the first time, she suspected, that he had talked about Margaret to anyone since the funeral. He talked about how she had laughed, about the letters they had exchanged before she came west, about how she had been unafraid of the land even when it overwhelmed her. He talked about it with a grief that had clearly aged, had moved from the acute and devastating phase into something more like scar tissue, present and shaping but no longer an open wound. She would have liked you, he said at the end. I would have liked her, Belle said. They sat in the cold evening and watched the last of the orange fade from the western horizon, and at some point his hand had come to rest on the porch railing near hers, not touching, but near, close enough that the warmth was perceptible in the cold air, and neither of them moved. Belle, he said, in the way that a person says a name when the name itself is the whole of what they need to say. Yes, she said. I don't entirely know what is happening, he said. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her, and the last of the daylight was on his face, and she thought about what the boy in town had said, that someone had turned him to stone, and she thought about her own answer, that stone could be warmed by sun, and she thought that she had not expected to be the sun in the metaphor, had not come here for that, had come here for the land and the cattle and a life she could build alone if building it alone was what the situation required. But she looked at Hugh Shelby in the last light of a November evening and understood that the situation had developed its own requirements, and they were considerably different from what she had planned. I don't entirely know either, she said, but I am not frightened by not knowing. I am, he said, and the honesty of it was so stark and simple that she felt something fill her chest like warm water. I am frightened by it. I was not frightened of much before, and then I was frightened of everything, and then I stopped being frightened by making sure there was nothing to fear. And now there is something, she said. Yes, he said. She did not reach for his hand, though she wanted to. She simply said, I am not going anywhere, Hugh. I am going to be right here on this land, through this winter and the ones after. And I am your neighbor, and I have been your friend. I think I have been your friend for a month now, and none of that is going to change on account of either of us being afraid. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I should go before the temperature drops further. You should, she agreed. He stood and put his hat on and stepped off the porch and then turned back. Tomorrow, he said, I am going to town in the morning if you need anything from the store. Coffee, she said. And I would like company if you are willing. He was quiet for a moment and then said, 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, she agreed. He rode home in the dark, and she sat on the porch for a little while longer in the cold, with the stars coming out enormous and brilliant above the flat land, and she felt happy in a way that was new and particular and complicated by an awareness of its own fragility. The trial of Garrett Foss was set for December, which gave the townspeople of Harlan's Creek 6 weeks to develop opinions, most of which they were not shy about expressing. The general consensus was that Foss had overreached in his usual manner, and that the evidence against him was substantial enough that even his money and his connections in the county seat would not be enough to prevent serious consequences. 2 of the hired men testified in exchange for reduced charges on their own accounts, which Pruitt had arranged with the patience and foresight of a man who had been playing a long game. Belle appeared before the county magistrate twice in the preparation period, presenting her testimony with the composed clarity that impressed observers and clearly frustrated Foss's attorney, who had perhaps expected a young woman alone to be a fragile witness. She was not a fragile witness. She was precise, factual, and possessed of a memory for detail that left very little room for the kind of contextual manipulation that defense attorneys in that era favored. Hugh testified as well on the matter of the surveillance he had observed from his fence line. His testimony was brief and densely factual, the kind of testimony that is difficult to challenge because it contains no interpretation, only observation. The conviction came on a Tuesday in December, 3 days after a snowfall that left Harlan's Creek under 6 inches of new white. Garrett Foss was convicted of cattle theft and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment and a substantial fine. His eastern land parcel, which had been bought through practices that now came to light in the trial, was placed under investigation by the county land office, and several neighboring families who had sold to him under pressure were pursuing legal avenues to address their losses. Belle heard the verdict from Rosalind Greer, who had attended the proceedings, and she stood in her kitchen with a cup of coffee and allowed herself a moment of deep and settled satisfaction. Then she went back to work because there was always work to be done. Hugh came that evening. He stood at her fence gate in the early dark with snow on the brim of his hat, and he said, "Heard the news." "Come in," she said. "I have made a proper stew." He came in. He sat at her table. They ate her stew and her cornbread, and the conversation moved easily through the verdict, and then through cattle matters, and then through less practical things. She told him about the books she had brought from Abilene, which filled a small shelf in the main room, and he asked about them with genuine interest, and she discovered that he had a small but well-chosen collection of his own that he had not mentioned. They talked about what they had read and what they thought about what they had read, and this particular conversation felt to Belle like the discovery of a new room in a house she had been living in for months, a room she had suspected was there, but had not yet opened. When it was late enough that staying longer would have been its own kind of statement, he stood and put on his coat and hat, and she walked with him to the door. And on the porch step, he stopped and turned and looked at her in the lamplight coming from inside the house. And he said her name the same way he had said it on the porch before, with nothing else after it, just her name as a complete sentence. She stepped forward and kissed him. She did it the way she did most things, directly, without hesitation, having decided that it was what she wanted to do and that doing it was better than not doing it. And if she had misjudged the situation, she would be wrong, but she did not think she had misjudged the situation. She had not misjudged the situation. He kissed her back with the same complete attention that he brought to everything, his hands coming to her face with a gentleness that was somehow more moving than any larger gesture would have been. And it was cold on the porch and warm between them, and the snow from the earlier storm was blue-white under the stars, and Harlan's Creek was quiet in all the enormous Kansas quiet of a December night. When they broke apart, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and they were both very still for a moment. "I did not plan that," she said. "I know," he said. "Neither did I. Are you all right?" she said, because she could see that he was moved in a way that ran deep. "I am," he said, and his voice was different, not the careful, measured economy of his normal speech, but something closer to the surface, something that was working to stay even. "I am more than all right. That is what I am attempting to manage." She laughed, and he looked at her with an expression that was unmistakably tender, and she thought that this was what the stone looked like from the inside, not cold at all, but preserved, waiting for the right temperature. December in Harlan's Creek was cold with the specific conviction of a plains winter, the kind of cold that settles into the ground and refuses to be temporary. And Belle worked her cattle hard in the shortened days and the long nights, and managed the feed supply with the careful arithmetic of someone who had done the numbers many times and knew exactly how much margin she had. Hugh came every 2 or 3 days, sometimes to help with specific work. He helped her cut firewood from a fallen cottonwood along the creek, and they did the work in the full December cold with their breath making clouds and the chips flying white from the axe strokes. And then she invited him in for the midday meal, and they sat by the fire and were warm together. Sometimes he came simply to come in the evening, and they would sit by the fire and read or talk or do both, and the ease between them was real and deep and growing. He was not transformed suddenly, the way it happens in stories. He was still a man who used few words and whose default expression was grave and still. But with Belle the gravity shifted. It did not disappear, but it became something different. The gravity of a man who is present and paying attention and moved by what he is paying attention to, rather than the gravity of a man who has decided to feel nothing. He began to smile. Not often, not expansively, but genuinely. At things she said, at the behavior of her cattle, at the particular personality of Congressman the Horse, who had taken a strong and entirely unexplained liking to Hugh and would push his nose against Hugh's shoulder with a familiarity that caused Hugh to smile every time despite his attempts not to. She noticed every smile and stored them away like the warmth they were. One evening in the second week of December, he brought her a book from his own shelf, a collection of essays that he said he had read twice and thought she might like, and she looked at the careful way he handled it, as if the offering mattered to him more than he was willing to say plainly, and she set the book on her own shelf next to the others and touched the spine and said, "Thank you, Hugh." "Don't lose the page markers," he said. "There, my wife put them in." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "I will be very careful with them," she said. He looked at her then. "I know," he said simply. "That is why I brought it." Christmas in Harlan's Creek in 1873 was modest by any standard, which was entirely appropriate for the frontier and entirely expected. Belle had been invited to Christmas dinner by Rosalind and her husband, and she accepted gratefully. And on Christmas morning she went first to check her cattle, and then to prepare the gift she had decided to bring. A jar of the preserved peaches she had put up in early fall, from the tree behind the barn that had surprised her with its late fruit, and a knitted scarf that she had made in the evenings over the past 3 weeks from wool she had bought at the general store. She knocked on Hugh's gate on her way into town. He came out of the barn with hay dust on his coat, and she handed him the scarf, which was dark blue wool, and he looked at it for a moment, and then at her with an expression that contained several things at once. "I know it is not much," she said. "It is a great deal," he said, in a voice that was quiet and very certain. He had something for her as well. He went back into the barn and came out with a wrapped parcel that turned out to be a pair of good leather gloves, lined with sheepskin, the kind that would make work in the cold genuinely less brutal. "I noticed your gloves are nearly through," he said. She laughed, and the laugh turned into something that almost moved her to tears, not from sadness but from the extraordinary ordinary precision of the gesture. He had noticed what she needed, and he had provided it, and that was a form of love that operated on the frequency of the practical and the deeply attentive. "Thank you," she said, pulling one on to try the fit. "These are perfect." "Good," he said, with the economy of a man who is satisfied. She looked at him in the winter morning light, the scarf now in his hands, and she said, "Come to the Greers for dinner. Rosalind would want you there, and I would like you there." He hesitated. "It is dinner," she said, "among friends. You have been allowed back into the world, Hugh Shelby. Come and eat Christmas dinner in it." Something crossed his face that she could only describe as the expression of a man who has been given permission for something he did not know he needed permission for. "All right," he said. "Let me clean up." Christmas dinner at the Greers' table was the first social occasion in which Belle and Hugh Shelby were visibly together in a way that required no interpretation. And the residents of Harlan's Creek being what they were, the interpretation was supplied by everyone present anyway, and with considerable enthusiasm. Rosalind managed this with the grace of a woman who has been waiting for it to happen, and is restraining herself from saying "I told you so" only barely. Hugh sat next to Belle and ate more than she had ever seen him eat, and contributed to the conversation at a level that seemed to surprise the other guests considerably, though it was familiar to Belle. He talked about the winter cattle market with Mr. Greer and about road conditions north of town with a man named Forrest who had a supply delivery business. And at one point, he made a dry observation about the territorial government that made everyone at the table laugh. And Belle caught Rosalind looking at her with wide eyes, and she looked back with the expression of a woman who has no intention of discussing this right now. Walking home in the blue winter dark after dinner, their horses walking slowly because there was no hurry and the night was clear, Hugh said, "I had forgotten what that was like." "A table full of people," Belle said. "Being ordinary among them," he said. "Not having to manage the way they look at me." She considered this. They looked at you tonight like you were simply someone at dinner. Yes, he said. That. She reached across the space between their horses and touched his arm briefly, through the coat, and he looked at the touch and then at her, and there was so much in his face in that moment, gratitude and something more than gratitude, want and something more than want, that she felt it in her own chest like a chord struck on an instrument. They stopped at her gate and he helped her with Congressman's saddle, which was his custom now, and they worked in the familiar way in the cold night. "Belle," he said, with his hand still on the saddle. "Yes," she said. "I am going to need you to know something," he said. He stopped, started again. "When Margaret died, I told myself I was finished. Not dramatically, not the way some men go. I closed the account. I told myself that I had had the thing and lost it, and that was how it was, and I was going to work the land and be what I was, and that was sufficient." She said nothing, listening. "You are going to need to know," he said, "that I mean every single thing I say to you. I do not say things I do not mean. I am not capable of it anymore if I ever was. And what I mean to say is that this," he gestured in a way that took in both of them and the space between them and the whole of the last 2 months. "This has become the most important thing in my life, and I wanted you to know that plainly without any uncertainty about it." She put her hand on his chest, over his coat, over his heart, and she looked at him very steadily. "I know," she said, "and it is for me as well." He kissed her then, in the cold December night at her fence gate, with the stars above them so numerous and bright that the snow on the ground reflected them in blue-white glitter, and she kissed him back with everything she had. And when they finally came apart, they were both breathing hard against the cold and his forehead was pressed to hers, and she could feel the warmth of him even through their coats. "Stay," she said. "Not, I mean, come in and sit by the fire for a little while longer. I do not want this evening to end yet." "All right," he said, "a little while longer." They went in and sat by her fire and talked until midnight, and then he went home in the deep cold of the Christmas night, and she sat alone by the banked fire for a little while after, in a kind of happiness that was quiet and deep, and nothing like the frantic quick version, but was, she thought, the real variety, the kind that plants its roots in the useful everyday soil of two people who have actually come to know each other. January came with a fury that was entirely in keeping with a Kansas plains winter. 3 blizzard events in the first 2 weeks, one of which kept Belle inside for 2 days with nothing but her cattle to manage and her books and the fire for company. And when the snow released her, she rode through drifts that came to Congressman's chest in places, and found her northeast fence line buried but intact, and her cattle all accounted for. And she was grateful for every preparation she had made, and every fence post she had properly sunk. Hugh came through a dug-out path in the fence on the 3rd day after the worst storm, appearing at her door with his own version of her situation, everything intact, cattle fine, himself slightly rearranged by 2 days of isolation but fundamentally solid. She made coffee and they sat at her table in the winter morning light, and she looked at him across the familiar surface and said, "Marry me." He looked at her. She had been thinking about it for 2 weeks. She was not impulsive. She was, in fact, constitutionally opposed to impulsiveness in serious matters. But she had thought it through with the same careful practical intelligence she brought to everything, and she had arrived at the conclusion that what she wanted and what made sense were the same thing, which was always a fortunate alignment. "That was direct," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have had 2 days in a blizzard to think, and I have arrived at the same answer I was arriving at before the blizzard, which suggests it is not a blizzard conclusion." He looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it, not the question of whether he wanted to. She did not think that was what he was working through, something else. "I am not the easiest person," he said. "I know," she said. "I have known you for 3 months, Hugh. I know exactly who you are." "And you are certain," he said. "I am entirely certain," she said. "Are you?" He reached across the table and took her hand, both hands over hers, and looked at her with the full weight of those gray eyes that were never cold with her any more, that were warm in a way she suspected only she ever saw. "Yes," he said, "I am entirely certain." They were married in Harlan's Creek in March of 1874, on a day when the first green was just beginning to appear at the edges of things, the tentative small green of a Kansas spring that has not yet committed but is beginning to believe in itself. The ceremony was conducted by the circuit preacher who came through every 6 weeks, a cheerful man named Reverend Coldest, who seemed genuinely delighted by the occasion. Rosalind Greer wept productively through the whole proceeding and was entirely unapologetic about it. Belle wore a dress she had made over the winter from a length of deep green wool she had bought from the general store in November, purchased with no specific occasion in mind. She had told herself at the time, which in retrospect she allowed was not entirely true. Hugh wore his best coat and his good hat, and he looked at her when she walked down the center aisle of the small Harlan's Creek church, with an expression that every person in attendance remembered for years afterward. The expression of a man who has been given something back that he had given up entirely, and who is in the full shock of the gift. She reached him at the front of the church, and he took her hand, and she looked at his face, and she said quietly, just for him, "You are not cold, Hugh Shelby. You never were." He squeezed her hand and said, equally quietly, "You are the only person who ever got close enough to know." The Reverend Coldest, who had heard enough weddings to recognize when something real was happening in front of him, smiled privately and proceeded with the ceremony. They stood together at the front of the small church and made their promises in the clear, plain language of the vows, and there was nothing theatrical about it, nothing performed. It was simply two people who knew each other standing in the presence of people who knew them and saying the things they meant. Afterwards there was food at the Greer's house. Rosalind had organized this with characteristic efficiency, and the town came and ate and visited, and there was fiddle music that turned into dancing on the cleared floor of the Greer main room, and Belle danced with Hugh with the same directness she brought to everything, and he danced with her with the same complete attention he brought to everything. And they were the subject of approximately 14 separate conversations happening simultaneously in the corners of the room, all of which they were entirely aware of and entirely unbothered by. They combined the operations in the spring of 1874. Not formally in any sense that required paperwork, though the paperwork came eventually, but practically, which was the form that everything real took in their life, practical first and the rest following after. The cattle were managed as one herd across both properties, using the creek access at the northeast corner that had been the heart of the whole conflict with Foss. The fencing was reorganized to reflect the combined territory. The Shelby house, which was larger and better built for weather, became their primary residence, and Belle's house was converted to a combination storage and guest structure with a sleeping room for when they needed it. The spring of 1874 was a good cattle season. Belle's marketing instinct honed in Abilene, where she had watched the trade more carefully than anyone expected a woman to watch. It proved to be a genuine contribution to the operation. She negotiated their spring sale at a price that was notably better than what the neighboring operations received, and Hugh, who had managed the land and the cattle with absolute competence but had handled the selling end with bluntness rather than strategy, was quietly and clearly impressed. "How did you know Dawson would go to that price?" he asked the evening after the sale, sitting on the porch of their house in the spring air that smelled of new grass and the creek. "I watched him at the sale last week," she said. "He bought the Forrest cattle at a lower price because Forrest was in a hurry to conclude. I was not in a hurry. When a buyer knows you are not in a hurry, they stop trying to use time as a tool." He looked at her with that full attention that she had come to know was his version of admiration. "I have been underselling for 3 years," he said. "Probably," she said, "but your cattle have been well maintained, which is why Dawson wanted them enough to pay my price. You did your part." He smiled. She loved his smile, all the more for how it had been rationed at the beginning. By the summer of 1874, Belle had become a recognized presence in Harlan's Creek, not merely as Hugh Shelby's wife, though that was how she was introduced in formal contexts, but as a person in her own right who brought things to the community that were valued. She was practical and knowledgeable, and she had no patience for the particular kind of social dishonesty that polite society sometimes confuses with kindness. Several of the women in town found her directness somewhat alarming at first and then deeply refreshing, and Rosalind, who had been her friend from the beginning, delighted in watching this evolution. Belle also became, in the way of people who show up and work and know what they are doing, someone that the newer settlers coming through Harlan's Creek sought out for advice about land and cattle, and the particular challenges of a woman trying to build something in a place that was not always inclined to let her build it. She gave the advice freely and specifically, and without softening the harder truths, and the people she advised generally did better for having heard it. The injustice of the land practices in the area, the Foss situation had exposed a pattern that went deeper than one man's greed, was something that Belle did not let go of. She attended the county land meetings and asked questions that were difficult to ask and more difficult to ignore. She was not a revolutionary in the dramatic sense, but she was relentlessly insistent on the factual reality of what was happening to small landowners, and particularly to women who had inherited or purchased land alone, and her presence in those meetings over time shifted things incrementally in the direction of fairness, which is how most real change moves. The Foss conviction had opened the county land investigation wider, and by the end of 1874, 2 families had recovered properties they had sold under pressure, and a third case was pending. The county land attorney, not Voss, who was a good man but not a fighter, but a younger lawyer named Harwell who had come in with fire, was pursuing the matter with a thoroughness that Foss's connections were finding difficult to blunt. In the late fall of 1874, with the cottonwoods going gold again along the creek road exactly as they had when Belle first arrived, she and Hugh stood at the northeast fence line together in the October afternoon light and looked out over the combined operation, the good fence, the well-managed herd, the creek access clear and active and undisputed. 1 year, she said. It was before the first frost, he said, looking at the yellow trees with the meditative expression that was his version of satisfaction, when you came to the fence line and told me someone had cut your wire. Yes, she said. I had not spoken to a person who mattered to me in 3 years, he said. And then there you were at the corner post in October, and you were so, he paused, finding the word. You were so present, so entirely there, I did not know what to do with it. You gave me information about the creek access, she said. I wanted to say something that would give you a reason to come back, he said. She turned to look at him, genuinely surprised. Hugh Shelby, that was your courtship strategy in week 1. I did not think of it as a strategy, he said, with the precise honesty that was his constant quality. I thought of it as the only thing I had to offer that seemed worth offering. She took his arm and leaned into him in the October afternoon, and he put his hand over hers on his arm, and they stood in the light together, and she thought about all of it. The warnings and the cold man and the corner post, and the cut wire and the Christmas dinner, and the blizzard and the proposal across a kitchen table, and the green dress and the church and the spring and the summer. The whole long story of 1 year that was actually the beginning of everything. You had more to offer than you knew, she said. I know that now, he said. You made that clear. She squeezed his arm. He squeezed her hand over his. The cottonwoods were gold against the enormous blue Kansas sky. In the spring of 1875, Belle discovered she was expecting. She told Hugh on a morning in April when the land was beginning its green and earnest renewal, and he stood very still for a moment, and she watched carefully for what crossed his face, because she was attentive to him in all things, and what crossed his face was fear first, immediate, honest, the reflexive fear of someone who knows what this can cost, and then something else moving through and past the fear, something that was hope in its fullest and most demanding form. She put her hand against his chest. I am healthy, she said, and Dr. Finn is capable and careful, and I am not afraid. "I know you are not afraid," he said. "You are never afraid of the right things." "I am afraid of the right things," she said. "I'm afraid of losing you. I'm afraid of losing this. I am simply not afraid of living it." He put his arms around her and held her for a long moment in the April morning light, and she felt his heartbeat and thought about how many things had had to happen in exactly the way they happened for this moment to be possible. In November of 1875, on a cold, clear night with the first frost of the new season on the grass, she noted the timing with private amusement and considerable affection. Their son was born. Hugh was present for the birth, which was not common practice but which he had made clear to Dr. Fenn was not negotiable, and Rosalind Greer was present as well. And the birth was difficult in the way that first births are difficult, but concluded with a healthy, loud baby boy, and a mother who was exhausted and intact, and had not, as she had promised, been afraid. Hugh held his son and did not speak for several minutes, and Belle watched him from the bed, and saw the full complexity of what was on his face: grief for what had been lost, and joy for what had been given, and love that was immediate and total and already absolute. And she said nothing, because there were no words that were the right size for the moment. She simply reached out and put her hand on his arm where he held the baby, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and everything that needed to be said was said in that look. They named him Randall Hugh Shelby, for her uncle and for his father. Randall was, from the first weeks, a person with strong opinions and considerable lung capacity, which Belle found entirely delightful, and which Hugh regarded with an expression of bemused respect that she found funnier than she told him. By the time Randall was old enough to be carried out to see the cattle, he had established himself as someone with views about everything, and Hugh introduced his son to the land with the same careful completeness with which he did all things, talking to the baby about the fence lines, and the cattle and the creek with the full seriousness of a man, explaining genuinely important things to an interested party. Belle watched this from the porch on spring mornings and felt something so large and warm in her chest that she sometimes had to simply stand still in it for a moment before going back to the day's work. The Shelby operation grew steadily and carefully through 1876. They added a second barn section, properly planned and built by Hugh with day labor from 3 men in town who had done good work for them before. They increased the herd to 60 head, which required the northeast pasture fully active and a new water line extension from the creek. Belle managed the books with the precision she brought to all practical matters, and the operation showed a profit in its second full year as a combined effort that allowed them to invest in the improvements rather than debt them. In the fall of 1876, Rosalind Greer came to visit on a Tuesday afternoon and sat on the porch with Belle and little Randall, who was now a solid and purposeful 10-month-old, much preoccupied with crawling toward things he had been told not to touch, and Rosalind said, "I want to say something." "Say it," Belle said. "When you rode into Harlan's Creek 3 years ago and I warned you about Hugh Shelby," Rosalind said, "I was warning you against a real danger. The man he was when Margaret died there was real damage there. I watched it happen, and I watched him close himself off, and I thought it was permanent." "It was not permanent," Belle said. "No," Rosalind said, "it was not. I want to say," she paused, "I'm very glad you did not listen to any of us. I'm very glad you are exactly the kind of person who hears a warning about a cold man and thinks about the geology of stone and warmth." Belle laughed. "Rosalind, how do you know I thought that?" "Because I know you," Rosalind said. "And because Hugh told my husband you said something about stone and sunlight the first day you met him, and my husband told me, and I have been meaning to tell you that ever since." Belle looked at the sky and shook her head and laughed again. "Also," Rosalind said, "my husband says Hugh Shelby is the best version of himself he has ever been, and if Thomas Greer, who does not say things like that, is saying that, then you should know it." "I know it," Belle said softly. "He tells me himself in his way." Randall chose this moment to successfully reach the object he had been pursuing, the edge of the porch step, and Belle scooped him up from the brink of his first significant tumble, with the casual reflexive competence of a mother who has learned to watch 3 directions at once. And Randall objected strenuously to the interruption of his plans, and Rosalind laughed, and the October afternoon continued around them, warm and gold. Hugh came home at the end of that afternoon to find the women on the porch and his son still protesting the injustice of the porch step intervention. And he came up the steps and took the boy from Belle and Randall, who had strong opinions about most people, immediately quieted and grabbed his father's coat lapel, and looked at the horizon with the expression of a person who is satisfied with his current situation. And Hugh looked at his son, and then at Belle and said, with a quality of plain joy that was so familiar to her now and so far from the cold reputation she had heard on that first October morning, "Good day." "Very good," she said. "How were the cattle?" "All fine," he said. I moved Diplomat's pen. He has been disagreeing with the younger bull. He has been disagreeing with the younger bull since September, she said. You should have moved him in September. I know, he said, with the expression that was his version of conceding a point, a slight shift of the jaw and a look that was somewhere between rueful and amused. I told you in September, she said. You did, he said. Remember that for next September, she said. I will remember it, he said, in the tone of a man who will not remember it and is making no promises. Rosalind Greer, watching this exchange, had the expression of a woman who is witnessing something that is both entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary, and who is wise enough to know the difference. She stayed for supper. They ate at the big table in the Shelby kitchen, their kitchen now, Belle's kitchen in every practical and emotional sense, with Randall in his chair, and the lamplight warm over all of it, and the smell of the food, and the sound of people talking, and the particular quality of a house that is fully alive. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and cold and clear, and the first frost of the 1876 season lay white on the grass, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold and would drop their leaves within the week. After Rosalind had ridden home and Randall had been put to bed with the thoroughness that only a very tired baby can achieve, absolute and immediate, as if sleep were a decision made and executed without transition, Belle and Hugh sat by the fire in the main room with their customary late evening quiet, which was the best quiet Belle knew, the quiet of two people who have said what needed to be said and are resting in the space that leaves. 3 years ago this month, Hugh said, looking at the fire. The first frost is later this year, she said. It was late October last year and early November the year before. This one looks to be mid-November. You track it, he said, in a tone that was not quite surprise and not quite not surprise. Of course I track it, she said. He turned to look at her from his chair, and the firelight was on his face, and he looked exactly like himself, exactly like the person she had been finding her way toward through all the careful months of fence lines and cold mornings, and cut wire and Christmas gifts and blizzards and proposals across kitchen tables, and he said, I was told you were the woman taking over the Talmadge land before you arrived. Clement Voss mentioned it. He said a woman from Abilene was coming alone. He paused. I thought that will not last a season, and, she said. And then you rode up to my fence line 3 weeks after you arrived in October morning cold with your eyes wide open, and you told me what you needed and how you intended to get it, he said. And I thought I was completely wrong about every single thing. She looked at him in the firelight and thought about all the things she could say, about the coldest man in 3 counties, and the stone and the sun, and the creek access and the cut wire, and the ways a person who has closed themselves off can be opened again, gradually and genuinely, by the right combination of circumstance and character, and simple daily proximity to someone who does not intend to be frightened away. She thought about all of that, and then she said what she always said when the full weight of it came to her in a quiet moment, which was nothing dramatic, which was the most honest thing she had. I am glad I came, she said. I am glad for all of it. He reached over from his chair and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat by the fire in their house on their land in the enormous Kansas winter night. And outside the stars were out in their full uncountable numbers over the flat dark land, and the creek ran under its skin of beginning ice at the northeast corner where their fence lines met, and the cattle were settled in the barn, and their son was asleep in the room above them. And the life they were living was the life they had each built separately and together, earned in the cold and the work and the honest words and the small particular gestures of two people learning each other with the seriousness, the learning deserved. Belle Talmadge, Belle Shelby now, though she kept both names in her head as a kind of personal history, the before and the after both belonging to her, felt the warmth of the fire and the weight of his hand and the deep settled peace of a life that had arrived at exactly the right place by exactly the right road. She had been told he was the coldest man in 3 counties. She had reached him before the first frost. And neither of them, in those early October weeks when they worked fence lines in the early morning cold and passed useful information over shared corner posts, had known what was happening. But it had happened. As plainly and thoroughly and lastingly as anything that has ever happened on the wide and windswept plains of Kansas, it had happened. And the winter, when it finally arrived, was warm.